The first spiritual practice I want to talk about is how these leaders engaged in Scripture and prayer. Not surprisingly, for their spiritual growth, Scripture was central and prayer was central. But there wasn't any form of Scripture or prayer that stood out among all the rest of the practices they engaged. What did stand out was that their practices were varied, adapted, and communal. By varied, I mean that these leaders changed their practices from time to time to suit their life situation or the specific ministry context that they would find themselves in. You would think that these common practices that stayed with someone for many years or even decades would be the thing that gave them longevity and resilience. But it was the capacity to vary their practices on a regular basis to suit their unique need and their unique stage of life that was helpful. A practice they used in their 20s was no longer helpful to them in their 30s as they engaged young children in an intense travel schedule. They had to change their practices to meet their unique stage and situation in life. Journaling practices came in and out of people's lives as was needed. Longer capacities to engage in younger phases without children no longer suited young mothers. They had to figure out how to engage Christ in a life filled with capacities that were suited to children being part of their life on a day-to-day basis. Variety became important for them as they engaged the practices of Scripture and prayer to keep things fresh, to meet their life stage and situation, to do what they could do along the way. By adapted, what I mean is that these leaders didn't do common practices that were taught to us through history in the exact same way. In fact, no one did any of the classic spiritual practices the way that they were given to us from history or tradition. But they adapted those practices to meet their life and situation as it was. People talked about doing mini examines, not Ignatian practice of examine from beginning to end. They would do it in small ways with their children at bedtime or at the dinner table. They would do it in small ways on the subway. These leaders were adapting their practices to suit what their life was given to them. One leader in the Philippines, for instance, had a 2-hour commute on a train every day. Her practices had to adapt to her capacity to spend time with God in a crowded, noisy public space. She varied her practices and she adapted them to what she could do in the space that God had given her, in the specific calling in that specific time and space. Now, what was surprising to me about all of their spiritual practices is that there was this intense and present communal driver to them. They varied their practices, they adapted their practices, but all of their practices had a communal element to them. Now, what I don't mean is that they always did their spiritual practices together with other people. But what I do mean is that their practices had connection to community all along the way. Some of the leaders would say things like, we engage in this prayer every morning. And when I would ask them what they meant by we, they would say, no, it's my church has decided that we do this, or my mission agency has decided we do these things together in the mornings. Together, but maybe alone along the way. Having a church or a mission institution together decide on some spiritual practice gave energy and accountability to the practices that these leaders found critically important to their journey. Now, one of the leaders had a spiritual practice of an inductive Bible study every night. He never missed an inductive Bible study for 5 years in a row. And at the beginning, I wondered, how does this have a communal driver? And at the very end of our conversation, he said, I forgot to tell you that what I do at the end of my Bible study is I give a summary of what God said to me and how He's inviting me to take another step in faith. And then I tweet it. And I asked him, what about that tweet was helpful to you? And he said at the beginning, it was very valuable for me to have accountability in that. I knew that if I told my friends I was going to have a Bible study and I didn't do it, I'd be embarrassed. So tweeting it out was a level of accountability that kept me going. And he said for the first 2 years, that was really necessary. But after the 2 years, I didn't need the accountability anymore, but I enjoyed the interaction and the community that was being formed as others joined me in conversation around the scriptures that we were reading. These communal elements provided accountability energy, and joy along the way. Varied practices, adapted practices, and a communal element to practices gave these leaders capacity to engage in scripture and prayer for decades along their lives. It gave energy to their relationship with Jesus and supported and sustained them in their calling.